thank you for taking 2 days out of your life, you know, to come and reflect on what we do and how we do it. And you know, I'm sure you had a great day with Michael. I've worked with Michael a number of times, so I have just incredible respect for him and his work. And Michael and I have done a couple different tag team kinds of sessions where you know, he does the person-centered approach, and then you know, I really try to reframe it from the fact that person-centered approaches just won't work if we're encased in a micro paradigm, right? And so all the good stuff that you heard yesterday, fantastic material. A lot of it you've already been doing or know or have incorporated. But I'm convinced, after 47 years in the vineyard, that it won't work unless we shift our paradigm from micro to macro. So that's going to really be the corpus of what I want to talk about today. But the first thing I want to do is apologize to you for Donald Trump. Honest to God, please, your Canadian friends, please just don't assume that Donald Trump really represents who we are and what we're about. So that's my first apology. So I want to get that out of the way. The second thing is, today I'm really going to talk about disability in a pretty holistic way. Not just about intellectual disability or developmental disability, but disability from a broad perspective, both congenital as well as acquired. And really think from a framework that disability is really within the natural course of our lives. And that every one of us here, certainly as professionals, we're paid to support people so that they can, you know, live full and inclusive lives in the community. But each of us will, if we haven't already, have an intersection, a personal intersection with disability. And either from a sense of your own personal life, or from your family around you, or from dear friends that you love and cherish, that disability will happen at some point. If you live long enough, it will happen to you. So disability isn't this sort of adjunct thing that, you know, we professionals sort of think about engaging. Disability is within the natural course of our lives. And so to that extent, that introduction to sort of macro is almost automatic. But I wanted to start today with sort of my own personal voyage. You know, Anna was very generous in her introduction, you know, talking about my experiences, and that I want you to know that first and foremost, I'm an advocate and a practitioner. I work, as Anna said, for an organization called CLASS, Community Living and Support Services. We support about 1,000 men, women, and children with all types of disabilities in Pittsburgh. And you've heard of Pittsburgh before, right? Yeah. You know we have a little hockey team. Yeah. I should have brought the Stanley Cup with me today. Coming up to Canada. But in any event, you know, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, a big Italian family. We live on a hill. You know, Anna was talking about Condeluci Hill, and I just want to sort of put that into perspective. When my family made their way from Italy to the United States, they ended up in Pittsburgh primarily because my grandfather had a cousin who lived in Pittsburgh, had gone from Calabria to the United States a couple of years before he came, and his cousin's name was Guido, and so I have a cousin Guido, so I want you to just to be leery of that. But but in any event, when Guido got to the United States, he ended up in Pittsburgh primarily because of the steel industry, and there were a lot of jobs and possibilities for people. And so Guido started writing letters to my grandpa and asking him, saying, "You've got to come to the United States. This is fantastic. There's lots of work, a good pay, a wonderful place, found a great Italian community. So why don't you come?" So Guido was really, really pushing my grandpa, his name was Antonio, to come to the United States. Finally, Grandpa garnered the courage, made the journey from Naples to Ellis Island in New York, and then ultimately on a train to Pittsburgh. He arrives in Pittsburgh, and waiting for him on the platform of the train station was Guido, with his arms wide open. He was so happy that his cousin Antonio was coming to the United States. Antonio gets off, and Guido embraces him and begins to introduce him to community. And that Guido was my grandfather's gatekeeper. Now I'm going to talk later about gatekeepers and the role that they play in building community. And so we'll come back to the Grandpa Guido story. But long story short, gatekeepers introduce newcomers to a community or culture about the elements of that culture that make for success. They introduce them, they introduce them to the language. They introduce them to where to shop, to how to get around. They introduce them to where the churches are and where the jobs are. So the gatekeeper really plays a critical role. Sociologists call it a bridging role. And we're going to talk about bridging as well from a macro perspective. But so Guido introduces Antonio to a variety of things. It helps him find a place to live in a little section of the town called McKees Rocks, which is just about 6 miles from downtown Pittsburgh. And it's a hilly little community that looks like Italy. It looks like where Grandpa came from, like the village of Fagnana Castel in Calabria, where Grandpa grew up. So he helped Grandpa get find a home to rent on a hillside in Norwood section of the Keys Rock. He helped Grandpa find a church, Mother of Sorrows Church, which our family still goes to. We sit actually in the same pew that Grandpa sat in when he came to the United States for the first time. So he introduced, Guido introduced Grandpa to where the market was, where Grandpa could get his capicola and his peppers and the kinds of things that he was used to eating. And then he introduced Grandpa to a job. He helped Grandpa get a job in the steel mill. Now Grandpa couldn't speak English, but he was strong. He was able to shovel that coal into the blast furnaces, and so Grandpa started his life in the United States. One of the things that Grandpa wanted to do, however, was when he lived in Italy, he took care of goats. He was like a goat herder. So he wanted to keep goats. So he got permission from a doctor who owned this property up above where he was living with his family, and he began to keep his goats, and he started a garden up there. He got permission to use that. Now the doctor told him, I'd like some goat cheese, and I'd like some tomatoes when you have them, and some peppers, and so it was a barter kind of a system. But which is, by the way, also another element of community. Reciprocity and bartering is something we're going to talk about as elements of community. But in any event, Grandpa started to keep his goats up on the hill, and as more and more children came, there were 9 Condeluci children that Grandpa and Grandma had. And as they got older, they would all go up on the hill to take care of the goats and take care of the garden. And Grandpa just loved this hill. He loved it so much that when my dad and my uncle Sanguine became old enough, they decided they wanted to buy this hilltop and move the family up there. Okay? And so they did. They made a deal with the doc who owned it, a handshake deal, $20 a month, no bank, no mortgage. They bought the hill. And the first thing they did is they built Grandpa a home right next to the goat shed. okay? And then they built homes for each other. So when I was born, there were 8 Condeluci families who lived up on the hill. All of my uncles and aunts, my grandpa and grandma, my mom and dad, of course, and all the Condeluci kids. There were like 40 of us. You know, the Italians know how to proliferate. You know that. So lots of Condelucis up there. Now, being born in that kind of a setting is unbelievable because there's just constant love around you, right? It's unconditional. You're loved because you're a member of the tribe. You know, not because you can do a lot of things, or that you're handsome, or that you're fast, or that you're good. It's that you're a member of the tribe, so you're automatically, you know, accepted and respected. And so it was for all of us. Now, obviously, we were held with responsibility. I couldn't do anything out on the street without somebody seeing me. I'd pick my nose, and my Aunt Betty yells. So there was the responsibility of community, but there was also this unconditional love and acceptance. And so growing up on this hill, my best buddy was my cousin Carrie. She lived right across the street, you know, from where we lived. She was my Uncle Will and Aunt Florence's daughter. And we were the exact same age, and Carrie and I we were born only 2 months apart, so we were like fused from the time we were just babies. We were buddies, and we were always together. I was always with Carrie. In fact, the first time I got separated from Carrie was when I went to school, and Carrie didn't go to school until first grade. So all the Condelucis would gather out on the street, and the kids, and we would walk down to the school. But Carrie stayed back. And I was really amazed by that. You know, I just didn't understand why Carrie didn't have to go to school. So finally, after about 4 or 5 days, going to school, coming home at lunch, there's Carrie playing, then we go back to school, come back home, there's Carrie playing, having fun. So I asked my mom, I said, Mama, what's the deal? How come Carrie doesn't go to school? And my mama says, oh, honey, Carrie's different. I said, what? She said, yeah, she really can't learn. I said, Mama, Carrie can learn. She knows how to play hide and go seek. She knows how to play the board games. She knows how to do the things that we all do. So what is this? You mean, what are you telling me? Mama said, well, honey, Carrie can learn, but she learns differently. She just doesn't learn the way the schools teach her. So I said, why? My mom said, well, honey, her difference is called Down syndrome. And the schools just don't know how to teach kids with Down syndrome. So Carrie doesn't have to go to school. I said, wait a second, Mom. You tell me that if you have Down syndrome, you don't have to go to school. My eyes widen. Okay. Can I catch this from Carrie? I don't want to go to school either. But you know, for me, in a very innocent way, it was an introduction to who's welcomed in community and who's not welcomed in community. Okay. And so, as we got a little bit older, all the Condeluci kids would go to social things in the community. Football games on Friday night, and, you know, church festivals, and street fairs, and parades down on the main street in McKees Rock. We'd all go together, and when we'd leave the hill, my mom would say, take care of your cousin Carrie, make sure she's okay. Carrie would come with us on those events. And when I'd get down onto the streets, I learned another lesson about who's valued, who's not, who's welcomed and who's not, by how people treated Carrie. And I got to tell you, it wasn't very good. And by the way, it's still not very good. Still. People made fun of her. People mocked her. Carrie had a cleft palate, so she couldn't speak very clearly. Kids would taunt her, play jokes on her. And I really, really got angry at those things. And I took my mother's admonition to watch out for my cousin Carrie very seriously, because I got into a lot of fights defending Carrie. At that moment, an advocate was born. I knew that what I wanted to do, I knew that it wasn't right or fair how she was treated. I knew that it wasn't right or fair that she couldn't go to school, or she wasn't welcomed in school. I knew that it wasn't right or fair how people dismissed her or devalued her, and I wanted to do something about that. And so I told my counselors, you know, in high school, when we got old enough to start thinking about careers and directions and vocations, when they would say, Al, what do you want to do? I said, I want to help people like Carrie. It's not right or fair that she's treated the way she is. And my counselors in high school said, well, you know, Carrie's different. Same thing my mother said. I said, what? But I couldn't see the difference. Carrie was exactly like me. I saw no difference in Carrie. And so I told my counselors, I said, well, you know, what do I have to do to really change things? Right? And the counselor said, well, you got to go to college and learn about disability. You got to learn about Down syndrome if you want to help people with Down syndrome. What did I know? So I believed that, by the way. And I go to college. And in college, I get introduced. Oh, by the way, I have some stuff up here. Keep your phones on. Tweet. Follow me on Twitter. Post some things that we're saying, maybe some quotes that we put up on Facebook. Or if you get bored, just text your friends. But keep your phone on. But in college, I get exposed to a micro perspective. And here's the micro perspective. Carrie has a problem. The problem actually has a name. When Carrie was born, the problem was called mongoloid when she was born. But then, you know, we changed that up and we called her retarded, and we changed that up to Down syndrome, and then we really got hip. We changed it to person with Down syndrome. Isn't that special? Wow. That's really helped Carrie. So, I'm learning this stuff in college, that we've got to have programs for people like Carrie. That she's better off with other people with Down syndrome. That in some ways, you know, she needs to learn things so she can be accepted, respected, and valued in the community. That Carrie was the problem. That's what micro models do. They identify the problem in the framework of the person. Now, I bought this, and you know, I go through college and I study the micro approach, and I learn how to develop programs, and I learn all about disabilities, not just Down syndrome, but all the other ones. There's a big book, by the way, that has them all listed. They're all listed in there. And you can read that book. As a professional, that's what you get introduced to. Understand autism. Understand spina bifida. Multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's that my dad had. You had to understand these conditions in order to really facilitate that people will be accepted, respected, and valued in community, which is, by the way, our goal. That's what you're paid to do. You're paid to create possibilities for men, women, and children who are experiencing disabilities to be valued, respected, and accepted in the community. That's what you're paid to do. And we think that the best way to do that is by identifying Carrie as the problem, rounding Carrie up and sending her to some place, ARC, community living, this group or that group, that somehow, some way, that's really going to help Carrie in the community. And I bought it. I thought so too. I graduate, I get a job in class, and there we are, working the micro model, creating programs and developing programs, and, you know, separate this and separate that, and we were really cooking. And I was able to pitch this and sell it to the funding streams and to the foundations. I was pretty good at that, actually, getting a lot of funding. And then, after about 5 years, I paused and said, have these really helped? Is Carrie valued, accepted, respected in the community? Had these things done what I hoped that they would do? And when I looked around, guess what the answer was? No. You know that that's not the truth. You know that the men and women you support are not valued and respected in the community. They're dismissed. If you go out on the street, on this Walkley Avenue, and stop any person and say, you know, I'm just moving to Ottawa, I'm coming up on my cousin Carrie, she has Down syndrome, what should I do? They're going to tell me to call you, the Ghostbusters. That you're going to know what to do. You have the answer. You have places for them to live, you have vehicles for them to ride, you have this, you have that. You even have, like, Special Olympics for them. I mean, it's great. So, in the generic community, The generic community begins to do this. Begin to abdicate their responsibility to Carrie as a citizen, as a fellow voyager in the community. And they suggest that she's better off over there. They even give money to you to help take care of her. Right? Now, once I began to awaken and say, maybe Carrie is not the problem here. Maybe the real problem is you, euphemistically you. I know you're not the problem. You're loving, caring people. You wouldn't be here today if you weren't. But maybe the problem is out there on Walkley Avenue and not Carrie. Now, that reframing of the problem is the shift from micro to macro. If Carrie is not the problem, then what is the problem? Right? And the problem are the attitudes and perceptions and perspectives of the greater community towards Carrie. They just don't see her value or worth. They don't see her relevance. They don't see her as one of them. They see her as like a special, separate species. So I start to get excited about this sort of new notion. And so I asked some people, what should I do? And they said, well, why don't you go to graduate school and study macro change? So I said, that sounds fantastic. So I go off to graduate school. I'm still working in class. And I get introduced to macro change theory by some radical, faculty members. And the macro change approach began to shift the gears and said the problem isn't the person, the problem isn't the individual, the problem is all of us. We're the problem. There's only one letter that separates those two words. The individual is the problem. All of us are the problem. Right? And so I started to say, well, this is making sense to me. This sounds like what I want to do. Because it was those people who were mean to Carrie that I wanted to address. It wasn't Carrie's fault. She didn't do anything wrong. It was them. Right? So I jump into the macro change phenomena with reckless abandon. And I became a radical change agent. Right? And now, what I got introduced to, now this is around 1975, 76, I get introduced to the fact that to do macro change means we have to change the rules of society. That the rules, that there wasn't a rule that Carrie could go to school. There wasn't a be able to ride a bus. There wasn't a rule in our culture for Carrie's rights. There wasn't anything guarding her rights. And so, I said, man, this makes sense to me. I'm going to go out and change the world. And so I graduate, and I go out, and I'm a radical change agent. I'm chaining myself to buses because they won't accept people with disabilities. They're inaccessible. I'm sitting in offices of HUD because there wasn't housing available for people with disabilities. I was barraging the education system because there wasn't rights to go to school. And so in 1976, we passed in the United States Public Law 94-142, which was the very first time that people like Carrie had the right to go to school. And so we passed that law in 1976. In 1978, we passed the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, saying Carrie has the right to work, damn it! And she should have an opportunity to work, and we should prioritize that. And so we passed that law. And then we passed the Housing and Urban Development Act, saying Carrie had a right to live in the community and to have an apartment, and have a home. And we passed that law. And then we passed the Urban Mass Transit Act, saying Carrie had the right to get on a bus. Buses had to accommodate Carrie. We passed a lot of laws in the 70s and 80s. And then in 1990, we passed the coup de grace, the big enchilada called the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that said Carrie has civil rights. Wow. I was pumped up. Man, oh man, we're changing society. We're changing the culture. And then I paused to look around. And guess what I saw? That the laws really hadn't changed society at all. Sure, there were some ramps, there was a curb cut, kneeling bus. Sure, there was a couple apartments that were accessible, but the attitudes were still the same. people still dismissed and devalued Carrie. They looked at her as really not one of them. They did. And I learned a really powerful lesson in this process, that we can't legislate attitudes and behaviors. We can legislate sidewalks and buses. We can legislate apartments, but we can't legislate attitudes. And even if Carrie has these other things available to her, she's in the party, but she's not of the party if the attitudes don't change. And so, I'm struggling to understand that there has to be more than just this. And so one day, a friend calls me and says, Al, there's a lecture going on at the university. And I was a student at the time. I went back to school. I figured there has to be some theory, some construct that I'm missing here. There has to be something. And so I go back to, I'm back at the university. I'm working on my PhD. And this friend comes over to me and says, Al, there's a lecture going on tonight at the university. There's a guy coming in from Harvard University, very esteemed university. And he's going to talk about social capital. And I said, what the hell is social capital? And he said, I don't know. He said, but let's go to the lecture and find out. And I said, does this have anything to do with disability? He says, I don't know, but let's go to the lecture. And so I go to the lecture to listen to Robert Putnam. I'm gonna come back to Putnam as we go through the day today. Putnam had this theory of social capital, and he was just introducing it. And so I don't know if you've ever had this kind of experience where things are cloudy and nebulous, and they're not making sense, and all of a sudden you start hearing things that begin to part the clouds. You begin to see a little more clearly. That happened to me that night, because what Putnam was saying was that what changes the world, not necessarily rules. Now, we do need to have rules, there's no question. We have to have safeguards and rules. But what changes the world are relationships. The sociologists call this social capital. That's what changes the world. That's what actually has changed you. If you take any attitude or perspective that you used to have, and it's different today, the reason it's different is not because some rule. The reason it's different for you today is because somebody you value suggested something different to you. And in your value of them, it's called social influence theory. Right? Do you remember your mother telling you who to hang around with and who not to hang around with? Your mother understood social influence theory. You remember your mother saying, don't hang around with Ronnie, he smokes and he drinks. Hang around with Billy, he's a nice kid, he goes to church, he helps his mother. And I still hung around with Ronnie. And so did you. Do you remember your mama saying, if they jump off the bridge, are you going to go too? And you said, I don't know, Mom, they're having fun down there. I think I'm going. Right? Your mama understood social influence theory. She knew that if you hung around with people who were twisted, guess what would happen to you? You would start to buy that. It's social influence theory. It's called value and image juxtaposition. These are sociological concepts and constructs about how people see the world. Now, the last thing, this is, by the way, just a warm-up. We haven't even gotten into the show yet. But the last point that I want to make about this odyssey for me, from micro to macro, and then from changing the rules to really seeing the relationships were the key, was the last point that I want to make before we get into some content. And that is, the greatest social change we have experienced in our cultures, Canada and the US, have happened right before our eyes, right before your very eyes and my very eyes. And it's the attitudes toward gay marriage. In the United States, about 20 years ago, there was a poll taken. How do people feel? How does the average person feel about gay marriage, same-sex marriage? And the average American said, I'm not for this. This is not good. The Bible says, I don't know, this doesn't sound right. This is raunchy, this is that. And 71% of Americans 20 years ago said they were against same-sex marriage. A poll was just taken 2 years ago, same poll, similar demographic reach. And guess what happened? In a 15-year period, one generation, those attitudes flipped. And 70% of the respondents in a poll just 2 years ago said, in America, in the United States, said same-sex marriage is fine. If two people love each other, that should be fine. Now, I don't know how you feel or what your attitudes are toward that particular issue. All I'm here to tell you is that is unbelievable social change. In one generation, the social change from 70 against to 74 or okay is amazing. As sociologists, as social theorists, as advocates for social change for the men and women with disabilities, we need to take a lesson from that book. And you know what the lesson is? Gay rights advocates began to say 20 years ago, if we want our rights, both the rules and the relationships, we've got to come out. We've got to come out. By the way, 2 days ago was National Coming Out Day. I don't know if you saw that. National Coming Out Day, right? Where people who are gay began to come out. Now, when that started to happen, as people started to say, look, we've got to come out. If we're ever going to get our rights, we've got to come out. As people started to come out, the very first thing that happened, which is a very predictable sociological phenomenon, is their friends and family went, what? You're gay! Oh my God! That's what happened. And by the way, that does happen when difference introduces itself, right? But then guess what happened? People, after that shock, began to say, well, that's my son. I raised him. That's my daughter. That's my cousin. That's my buddy from college. That's my lifelong friend from the neighborhood. So what if they're gay? Ain't no big deal. The relationship, the power of the relationship, the power of social capital overrides differences and creates a flatter, more valued community. Right? So, all the things we've done in our micro model have excluded or segregated or separated people. They're hidden, they're in the closet, they're not perceived to be a part of the community, but they gotta come out. We gotta get those guys and gals out. And we've gotta be really strategic about it, because here's the other introductory lesson. If you look at the average relationship patterns, and by the way, I've been studying social capital now like a maniac. You know, I've written books about it. I brought 2 books that I wrote about it recently. That go over all the literature and all the data. One about changing rules, the other about building relationships. And I teach it at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Social Work, in the School of Health and Rehab Sciences. I practice it at class with the men and women we support. So I've been really digesting everything I can get my hands on in relationship to social capital. And let me just give you this statistic. The average person, listen to this, has about 150, 160 important relationships in their lives. 160. I see you down there, you're going like this. But in reality, if I did a social network inventory on you, if I sat with you, and which is what we do, by the way, at our agency, is we really look at the social connections of the folks that we support. If I did that with you, you would be amazed at the people you know, and at the people that impact your life, and sometimes in ways you never even thought about. Right? Yet they do. So just tuck that away, and we'll get into that a little bit more in theory as we get into the show. But the corollary to that is, how many relationships do you think, just take one client in your mind right now, one consumer, one member, one participant, whatever you call them, just take one person and think about how many relationships that they have in their lives. Now I got to tell you, we were really taken by that question. And a couple years ago, we embarked on a research study in 7 different cities around the world. In Toronto, we partnered with Community Living Mississauga. In Vancouver, we partnered with Connect Community. It's a brain injury service in Vancouver. In the United States, my own organization in Pittsburgh, an organization called JFM in Portland, Maine, an organization called Community Works in Kansas City, an organization called Hope Network in San Jose, and then an organization called Mamre in Brisbane, Australia. And with these 7 research sites, we conducted social networking interviews with random clients in their pool of service. And what we discovered was that the average number for folks with disabilities, the average number of relationships reported were about 26. 26. Now, it's also important for me to tell you that in that number, in that 26, a third of those were family. Another third were other people with disabilities in the group home, or in the bowling league, or in Special Olympics, or whatever they were doing. The last third were youth, staff. Now, if there's anything that's tragic, it's that. And if we want to create an opportunity for people to live, work, play, and be a part of the generic community, that has to change. That's never going to happen if people are that isolated. And you know what happens with social isolation? It leads to death. It leads to, I'm going to show you the data, by the way, on social isolation. We know that as many people in Canada die annually from social isolation. Let's not take disability off the table. Social isolation. As many people in Canada die annually from social isolation as from all smoke-related diseases and illnesses every year. Smoke-related diseases and illnesses, respiratory, cardiological issues. As many people die from social isolation. In fact, historically, social isolation has actually been a punishment. Right? We put people away, get out of here, you go over there, we don't want you with us. Even when you were a kid, you remember your dad said, get to your room until you learn how to behave like the rest of us. Your dad said, then you're to your room. Social isolation, punishment. And today, that is the highest form of punishment. Solitary confinement. The worst, you know, you talk to anybody who's ever been incarcerated, it's the worst punishment you can get, is to be socially isolated. And here's the deal, guys. The men and women you serve are socially isolated. And we cannot stand for that. All the person-centered, stuff in the world that you learn is not going to turn that around until we get that principle, until we understand that. And once we begin to understand that, we begin to put those two together, macro change, understanding social capital with person-centered planning, now we can change the world. Now we can change the world. Okay? So, let me just share some concepts. I have this quote up because I love this notion. Right? Discovery consists of looking at the same thing that everybody else has looked at, but thinking something different. Right? We're going to look at the same thing that everybody else is looking at over here, but we're going to think something different. And as we begin to do that, we discover things change. It's like a hologram, right? If you go to an art museum, there's a hologram, and that hologram is up on the wall, and you're standing over on this side of the room, and you're looking at that hologram, and you look at it, and colors kind of are all predictable. But if you move across the room, you move over to here, and now you look at that very same hologram from another perspective, totally changes. The colors are different. It jumps out at you. There's other things you see, other possibilities, other strategies that we can employ to make sure that Terry builds social capital and has an opportunity to put value in the community. So with that in mind, here's the starting point. What do people want? The men and women that you've been serving all these many years, and you've been at it a lot of years, what do they want from your agency? What do they want you to do for them? You know, for 47 years, I've been asking families this. And for my 68 years with my cousin Carrie, I've been asking this. What do you want, Carrie? What can we do for you? Right? And that's the very important question for us as providers. What do you want? It's customer service, right? What do you want us to do for you? What do you want? And when you talk with people, and this is just a condensing of all the things that I've heard, trying to sort of put it into some understandable framework, the very first thing we hear from families is they want their sons and daughters to be healthy, happy, and safe. And by the way, this is exactly what you want for your kids. And this is exactly what you want for yourself. Be healthy, happy, and safe. That are always the top variables. Right? They're always the number 1, 2, and 3 in any outcome analysis. But then you also, they want to do something meaningful. People want to participate, and people want to be able to live where they choose to live, and people want to be able to get around their community. We're social animals. We need to be with people. That means we have to be able to get to them. They have to be able to get to us. Right? And then lastly, we want to build relationships and friendships. Excuse me, my phone's ringing. It's just my wife. She wants me to bring milk home tonight. So I'll get that. Sorry about that. I was tweeting earlier, by the way. I was taking pictures of you guys and tweeting them out today. So, but the last point is that people want friendships, right? And relationships. Without them, the world's a wilderness. Without friendships. So these are the things we want. So how have we done Canada? How have we done America? How have we done Australia? How have we done Ireland on these goals for men and women and children with disabilities? And so let me show you the data. This is data from the US, but my friends in Canada at the community living systems that I meet with all the time tell me that these data hold here as well. Right? So we know that a 76% of adults with disabilities, working age, 16 to 60 is the cohort, are unemployed or underemployed. 76%. I mean, that's an incredible failure. We know that only 6% of people with disabilities own their own home. Most of the time people are in some program or some structured ICF, group home, some setting. That public transportation, the ability to get around, because people with disabilities don't have cars, they don't have the money to buy a car. Many of them don't have the skills to operate a car, get a license to drive a car. So consequently, the only way they can get around is through either public transportation or through family and friends. And that's the only way. So we know that public transportation is being cut, that communities are really saying that constituents are saying to politicians, we drive cars, we don't take the bus, we want lower gas, we want better roads. Public transportation is for those poor people. And now in America, that's really been, you know, I mean, in the United States, you have, you know, just the incredible rhetoric of devaluation of poor people, and devaluation of not just minority groups, but people with disabilities, and consequently, then people become isolated just because they can't get around. Friendship voids, social isolation are the rule of the day. Think about any of your clients, and you'll recognize that they're really isolated. Vulnerable people are at incredible risk of violence. We know that violence and disability are co-related, and that people with disabilities are at greater risk of being treated violently. And by the way, that's not just a generic community thing, that they're treated violently in programs. In programs. That 32% were satisfied, there's limited this, there's limited that, even increased morbidity. If you look at any life expectancy tables on disability, you'll discover that typically they show that people with disabilities die 10 to 15 years sooner than typical populations, right? 10 to 15 years. Now we dismiss that by saying, well, they have disabilities. That's the reason. I'm here to tell you that is not the reason. The reason why they do die sooner, we know that. But I'm here to tell you, it's caused by social isolation, not by their condition. And so, Why haven't we done better? How can we do better? I mean, this is obviously the salient question. This is what got you here for 2 days. How can we do better? You know this stuff. I don't have to show it to you. You know that the folks that you support are in very limited situations. You know that, right? The real question is, how can we do better? Right? What does it take for us to do better? Well, the very first thing is to understand that we use a flawed paradigm. That we're still stuck here in this micro model. Look at this cartoon. Here's a bee. He's on the honeycomb, and he has a map of the honeycomb. And he's still lost. That's his female companion there saying to him, face it, Fred, you're lost. Now, how could you be lost if you have a map? Well, if I want to come to Ottawa from Pittsburgh, I've got to have some paradigm, some framework, some map to get me here. But I can't just get any map. I mean, if I have a map of Vancouver, how does that help me get here? I mean, I have a map, Vancouver, but it doesn't help me get to Ottawa. You gotta have the right map to your destination, right? If we have the wrong map, we're gonna continue to have the wrong outcomes. So we have to first have the right map. And that's the shift from micro to macro. Let me show it to you. This is a focus on paradigms, right? And paradigms is just a Greek word. It just means maps, structure, boundaries. How do we get from one point to another? That's what paradigm means. Now, most of us still use the micro paradigm. And let me show it to you in kind of an sort of a simple way here, right? Here are some 4 tenets of a micro paradigm. It first looks at deficiencies and weaknesses and struggles that people have. But when you assess a client, this is what you assess. What they can't do, what they struggle with, what they're not good at, what their problem is. And then the second tenet is separation and congregation. Right? Relegation to a program. You go over there, they'll teach you what you need to know. They'll really help you with what will make your situation better. Now, everybody agrees with the goal, but a micro paradigm sort of sees its direction to the goal through changing the client. Right? The goal is the same. We want Carrie to be valued, respected, and included in the community. We want her to be celebrated in the community, just like everybody else. We all have that same goal, even people in a micro paradigm. And every one of you have had experience, personal experience with the micro paradigm, not just in your agency, but in your life. In your life. When you've been sick, this is the paradigm you go to. And by the way, the paradigm has great success with sickness. Okay? So you call your doctor, and you say, my stomach hurts, or I have this problem. And your doctor says, come on in, and they do an assessment of your problem, right? And they really want to get to the root of it. What's causing your problem? Is it a tumor? Is it an ulcer? Is it this? Is it that? An infection? Get to the bottom of the problem. That's what a micro paradigm does. And often the micro paradigms will segregate us or congregate us, right? To hospitals or to clinics or to places where we can be, reviewed and assessed. And then there's an expert who understands infection or cancer or cardiology or gastrointestinology. They understand those things. And the expert then helps us get fixed. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I just had a hip replacement, right? I went through the very same thing, right? I have this arthritis in my hip. I can't move it very much. I can't, walk around great distances. So I go in, they separate and congregate me with other people with bad hips in a little orthopedic ward. And then they cut me, and they saw me, and they put a new titanium hip in. And voila, look at me. So, and this works. And we're happy because it works. But here's the key. It works on sickness. And the Carrie is not sick. She's not sick. She gets sick. And when she gets sick, go to the medical model. Go to the micro model. But Carrie is not sick. You're not trying to help her cure something. You're trying to help her get some friends, you know, get a place to live, you're trying to help her get a ride, you're trying to help her build some friendships. That's what you're trying to do. So this model is really irrelevant to what people want from us. Okay? So here's a detail of it. By the way, I didn't make this up. I mean, this is right out of the literature. I wrote an entire book on this called Interdependence. You know, in fact, I wrote that book in 1990! 1990! 26 years ago! I wrote a book that exposed this. And here I am, showing the same damn slide I showed in 1990. So, the other key thing about a micro model is that it looks at deficiencies. It looks at difference. Difference becomes really important. And we have to have a name for it. We have to really understand it. The difference, becomes the key. And we hold it up. And here's what we know sociologically about difference, is that we identify the difference, and then that difference then creates great stereotypes, and the stereotypes separate the person, and then the person is avoided and stigmatized. In fact, let me show you the effects of difference. And this comes right from a book I wrote in 1995. The book was called Beyond Difference. And while I was writing that book, that was 21 years ago, when I was writing that book, I spent a month at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The Holocaust. And when I was there, here's what I learned. Here's what happened in Nazi Germany in the 30s. Right? First started with misunderstanding. These Jews, we're having a recession, these Jews have money. So the misunderstanding, then the avoidance, then people not being welcome, then Jews being banned, then Jews being banished to ghettos, and then Jews being isolated or sent to the death camps, and then lastly Jews being murdered. 6.5 million murdered. But what was really face-slapping to me, as horrific as this is, that the very same thing happened 15 years earlier to people with disabilities. That literally over 1.5 million people with disabilities were murdered in the same sort of framework in Nazi Germany. Right? And here's the last slap to me, is this is still happening today to people with disabilities. Still.